welcome to the 46th webinar from Istanbul at Sabahattin Zaim University, the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. Today we have a topic that is on all of our minds. The world is stopped and watching as Russia has invaded Ukraine over the last week. We have entered day 7 of the invasion. It is one of the top geopolitical events of our time. To comment on this historical event, we're joined by our director, Dr. Sami Al-Arian, and I'm also joined by Professor Jalal Khashib, both of which are associates at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. Dr. Sami needs no introduction, but Professor Khashib is a geopolitical strategist who focuses on the MENA region. So I welcome our participants first, and I will first hand over the floor to Dr. Sami to begin his opening comments on the topic. Dr. Sami, you have 30 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes. We want to leave enough time for a question and answer.
Thank you very much, Awais, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening. Let me start the sharing for this lecture. All right. Well, as you all know, we're going to talk about Russia's war in the Ukraine. I do have some disclaimers at the beginning. I'm not trying to pick sides. I'm trying to be as dispassionate and unemotional, because it seems like this case, this crisis, has a lot of people up in arms. A lot of people are very emotional about it. It's very difficult when you have war to be not to be emotional or to pick sides. My role today is to have to have an attempt to understand the facts and how international politics and great power competition works in a geopolitical theater. My second disclaimer is there are no good guys and bad guys, and I will explain why that is the case. You know, Western media and Western leaders are trying, obviously, always to make whatever their enemy is as Satan, and without giving any kind of background. And what I'll try to do today is to give that background. This is not about absolving anybody from doing any wrong. Every war certainly is terrible. I mean, we can't justify wars, but we have them, and we need to understand why they happen. And that what we're witnessing today before our own eyes, for the first time in the European theater, a real war taking place, but it is within the context of pure power competition at the highest levels. My third disclaimer, which is about my opinions, that I've always supported people's quest for democracy, for justice, for independence, and representative government, the rule of law, human rights, and so on and so forth. But that always comes within the understanding that this is not about utilizing or using these kind of lofty ideals in order for some other foreign power to take advantage of people's quest for democracy, justice, and human rights. And therefore, for me, resisting foreign occupation, foreign intervention, and colonialism comes first before any other ideals. So let me start by talking about a little bit of background. In the United States, as you know, and I've said that many times before, there is something called the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe is James Monroe, who was the 5th president of the United States. This doctrine was announced in 1823. That's almost 2 centuries ago. And basically what it says, and if you could look at this map, the United States was not even still in its infancy, trying to bring itself to become power, let alone great power. Even the whole Western Hemisphere was part of Mexico, as you see, while the Northwest, of course, was under British, and of course, what came to Canada. At any rate, what the Monroe Doctrine declared at the time is that no foreign power, no foreign colonial power would be permitted by the United States to take hold or to have military bases in the Western Hemisphere, not only in the United States, not only in North and Central America, but throughout the Western Hemisphere, which also included South America. Bear in mind, at the time, you had all these colonialist powers. You had Portugal, you had obviously the British, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, and so on and so forth. Now, why am I saying this? Because it's very important to understand the background of what become great power is that they would like to be the sole hegemon in their own region so that they can start becoming great power outside their region. If they cannot become a hegemon, or if they can't become a great power within their own region, how can they go outside and start exerting their power in different regions? So getting back to this, so this is the map of the Western Hemisphere. As you could see, this is the modern United States, and it does not really allow any foreign power. If that happens, as one time happened in 1961, they go at great lengths to make sure that does not stay. Here is an example. In 1961, when the US discovered in October of that year that the Soviets at the time, whom they were having this great power competition, actually started putting nuclear warheads, as you could see, on the island of Cuba. This is the United States. This is the island of Cuba, which meant that this is in the Western Hemisphere, which violated, as far as the US decision maker, the US government, the Monroe Doctrine. Of course, for the next 13 years, for the next 13 days, the whole world was up in arms. We were at the brink of nuclear exchange, nuclear catastrophe. And of course, eventually that situation, as you could see here, that the whole United States was within range of Soviet missiles. But there were behind the scenes negotiations between the Americans and the Soviets at the time. And the reason the Soviets moved and were trying to impose their presence in the Western Hemisphere as a response to Americans' stationing of nuclear missiles in Turkey. As you could see, Turkey, which was a NATO member at that time for almost a decade, its territory was used to station American nuclear missiles and American warheads against the Soviet Union. As you could see, there is only the Black Sea, which meant it was in close proximity. So that crisis was averted by having this secret behind the scenes agreement that first the Soviets will back down, they will remove their missiles, they will remove their warheads, and eventually the Americans will move theirs from Turkey, and therefore both sides would have gained something. Of course, there was a caveat that the Americans insisted that this deal would not be announced. Had it been announced, the Americans would deny it and they will press on. Of course, they started the blockade and they were willing actually to bomb the hell out of Cuba if that would have persisted. But of course, with the withdrawal of the Soviets and eventually the withdrawal of the Americans, that crisis was averted. Now, going back to the Monroe Doctrine, as you could see, when we talk about Cuba, if there is a foreign great power and came to the south of the United States, let's say here in Mexico, and they try to establish a military presence, not even nuclear or not just military presence, the US will never tolerate that, and they will stop it by all means necessary, because that would be perceived in the United States as a great threat, not to speak of other countries in the Western Hemisphere. Now, throughout the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, we had two military alliances that existed, and the theater was Europe, because that's where War II was mainly fought. And what we had was a series of countries that came on the western side of Europe that comprised the what is called NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was born in 1949. And across the Atlantic, there were 2 countries, and then 10 in Europe. That's when it started in 1949. And then they started slowly expanding. So they had 12 founding members, which included countries like the United Kingdom, Italy, Belgium, France. France pulled out from the military and kept the political side because of Charles de Gaulle. But beside that, we had 10 countries, and then slowly they started expanding. But between 1949 and 1990, it only expanded to 4 countries: Greece and Turkey in 1952, Germany in 1955, and Spain in 1982. So by the end of the Cold War, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had about 16 countries that belonged to NATO, and NATO meant this is the Western military alliance. On the other hand, on the Soviet side, we had the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw, of course, is the capital of Poland. This is when they got together and they established another military alliance in order to confront NATO. And that included all these countries, as you see. Of course, the Soviet Union itself had 15 provinces that included the Baltic states of Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, included Belarus, included the Ukraine, Moldova, and so on. And of course, these were what's called the Eastern Europe, which like, East Germany, of course, because Germany was divided into East and West, Poland, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, which later on became the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and Yugoslavia, which also disintegrated into 6 different countries. But all together, of course, Yugoslavia had its own politics with Joseph Broz Tito, in which it was part of the non-aligned movement. But beside that, this whole blue bloc became the Warsaw Pact. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, several things happened. Now, towards the end of the Eastern Bloc or the Soviet Union, there was a lot of chaos going on. And there was a tacit understanding or an agreement, it wasn't written, between the German side, Helmut Kohl, and Gorbachev, who was the last Secretary General and the President of the Soviet Union at the time, is that for the Soviets to allow for German unification, East and West, that there will be no expansion of NATO. That also came later from a meeting that took place between the Secretary General of NATO, the political side, because NATO is always led militarily by an American and politically by a European. It came through a promise, not only by American leaders, but also by the Secretary General himself at the time, is that NATO would not expand. In other words, you can let go of your fears of having a military threat at your doorstep. But what happened, of course, is that this is the Soviet Union. It was comprised of 15 republics. 6 of them what's called the Muslim republics here. This is Armenia and Georgia in the south. And then, of course, these are the Baltic states. This is Belarus, number 3. Number 2 is Ukraine. Number 9 is Moldova. So this, of course, disintegrated and became 15 separate independent states. What Russia perceived at the time is that it has a huge buffer. If we go back to the map here, this whole thing was considered a buffer for the Soviet Union. In other words, the Western alliance, NATO, the Western military alliance, NATO, is going to have a huge land mass before actually on land troops get to the Soviet Union. But even when they station any kind of missiles, it's going to take a while before they actually hit the Soviet Union. That was the idea. But of course, when the Soviet Union collapsed and became independent states, the understanding is that NATO is no longer needed because there is no enemy. That enemy has collapsed. Now, that wasn't the case. You could see here, this is the expansion of NATO. In 1949, we have the 12 states, which are 10 in Europe and 2 in North America. 1952, we had Turkey and Greece. 1955 was Germany. 1982, we had Spain joining. This is after the collapse of the dictator. 1990 is when we had the German unification. So it was agreed by Russians at the time is that, yes, since Germany, of course, their demand was that Germany should be non-aligned, but they couldn't press for that. So they agreed that East Germany, after its unification with Germany, would be part of NATO. But then what happened is that for the next 9 years, nothing happened. But in 1997, NATO announced that it will start accepting members. Of course, that was to the chagrin of the Russians at the time, but they were too weak to do anything about it. So by 1999, they had 3 countries joining, which were the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. And then 5 years later, they admitted 7 other countries: Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Baltic states, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. And of course, again, the Russians were too weak to do anything, so they had to swallow it very hard, but they were extremely bitter about it. Even Yeltsin, who succeeded Gorbachev as the first president of Russia, and who was very close to the Americans, a personal friend of Bill Clinton, who was the president at the time in 1999, was very bitter about it. And he said how he was betrayed by the Americans and Western leaders who assured him that there would be no expansion of NATO. Even during that time, after Putin became vice president and then, became prime minister and then president in early 2000, he even explored the idea of Russia joining NATO. And I will show some documentation about that. And of course, they didn't take him seriously. They just dismissed him out of hand. But within a few years, as I said, in 2004, they had the Baltic states. These are the Baltic states right there. Not only at the doorstep of Russia, but they were former republics within Russia. Now, every other country that I have named so far, in 1999, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, in 2004, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, and what came later in 2009, 2 more countries, this was the 4th expansion, Albania and Croatia, and 2017, Montenegro, and then 2020, North Macedonia. All these were part of the Warsaw Pact. All of them, obviously not the Croatia, because they were part of Yugoslavia or Slovenia, but the others were part of the Warsaw Pact. In other words, they were former allies of the Soviet Union, and some of them were actually part of the Soviet Union. They were ruled by Russia for many, many years. Now, as you could see, these are the different countries that were expanding. These were the borders in 1990, and they kept expanding eastward, 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 closer and closer to Russia. And of course, the question was, why are you doing this? If we are not the enemy, why is the Western Alliance, why is NATO keeps expanding eastward? I mean, that was always a question that the Russians would ask their counterparts, and they never really get a straight answer because it's collective security. And of course, let's remember that the Article 5, which says within NATO that this is the article that but imposes on every member of NATO to fight because one member has been attacked. That was only used once during the 2001 September attacks against the United States. So all these things that were happening since then, whether in Afghanistan and the so-called global war on terror, it was NATO was involved based on that, and of course based on the pressure from the United States, because it was never meant to be a global military alliance. It was meant to defend Europe, yet it was used at the request of the United States to fight all its wars around the world in the name of the global war on terror. But nevertheless, so if people think that these small powers had the independence, that they can make their own decisions, then they would not be living in real world. Obviously, all these countries are very weak countries. They can hardly be called democracies, but they were manipulated through the different regimes, whether it's economic regimes, financial incentives, or military incentives, or otherwise, to be a part not only of the military alliance led by the United States, but also of the European Union, in which they can get a lot of economic help. Now, if you look at this map that shows the Russian Federation, certainly Russia is the largest landmass, but it's not well defended. The Russians are well aware of what happened to them in World War II, which was that they lost 20 million people. I repeat, Russia lost the most number of people during World War II, 20 million people, while the Germans themselves, who were the aggressors and the invaders, lost about 8 million from all their enemies. But the reason the Russians lost a lot is because it's very difficult to defend. And once you pass Moscow, there isn't much you can go to. So as a Russian official, as a Russian president, as a Russian government, as a Russian strategist, you could see that the encroachment of NATO going eastward every few years, where they will be at the doorstep, the distance between the border of Ukraine right here and Moscow is 500 kilometers. That's not, in military terms, that's not a lot of distance. From Kiev, it's about 800 kilometers. That's very short distance on invading army. So certainly the Russians felt threatened. And it wasn't really explained well, why does NATO need to expand every few years at the door of Russia? And of course, there are answers to that. This is not a mystery. For NATO to justify itself, it has to have an enemy. If Russia is not the enemy, there is no need for NATO. So to justify the presence and existence of NATO, and therefore the hegemony of the United States in Europe, because the US, its leverage, its huge leverage on Europe, is that it guarantees their security. And without NATO, it cannot guarantee this. And of course, without having an enemy, there is no need for NATO. So Russia was actually declared, even though Russia has become a very weakened state, its economy is about less than 5% of the US economy. It lacks technology, it lacks many things. And of course, it does have authoritarian tradition, and no one can claim, but that's true also for Hungary and other places where they became part of the European Union, as well as part of NATO. So that's not an excuse. At any rate, you could see that many strategists, what they call realists, they understood that with the continuous expansion of NATO, you are basically playing with fire, because at one point, Russia is going to put its line in the sand. It's going to draw its red line and said, enough is enough. We're not going to take it. So that's what happened. You know, this is obviously Belarus is part of Russia. They have Russian citizens. What you have here in Ukraine is that Ukraine is the largest country in Europe, about 233,000 kilometers. It's larger. It's about twice as much as Germany. It's about 3 times as much as maybe less than 2.5 times as much as Britain, and so on. So what you have here is a country that had been for many, many years part of the Soviet Union, of Russia. So there's a lot of Russian community living in the eastern side, in the Donbass region, as well as there are 2 republics here. About 17% to 18% of the population are ethnically Russians. And of course, they were not happy with this westward type of movement towards integrating Ukraine within the European system as well as within NATO. So there was a lot of resistance here. But before I jump to that, I just want to also show that the United States, part of its hegemony, is to establish military bases around the world. And what you see today, of course, is that we have about 750 to 800 bases around the world. mostly in Europe, in East Asia, as well as around the world. This is the composition, depending on what country you're in. You could have anywhere from 1 base to over 26 bases. The yellow ones are where you can have military access. Your military facilities could have access, whether it's fueling or other things, and other suspected places as well. Here are even more. This map gives you more information about where these are. And you could see much of them are also surrounding the Russian Federation. When you try to find out where Russia has bases, it hardly exists. There's one in Syria and another one in Asia, and that's about it. There isn't much that they have. So you could see who's circling whom and who poses a threat against whom. Now, let me just say something here, how we got here. The way we got here is that when the Russians were always grumbling to their counterparts in America and Europe that this expansion of NATO is actually looked at in Russia as being a threat to their security, NATO didn't care, didn't pay any attention. After the expansion in 2004, there was of course, they played a little ball with Russia. They had what's called the NATO-Russian Committee. So they would meet once in a while and talk about nonsensical issues, which did not address Russia's concerns. And of course, Russia eventually pulled out of this because it found really no reason for that. Even though, as I said, Putin himself was trying to tell them, why don't you invite us and become full member of NATO? They will always come back, oh, you're not Democrat, you are not this, all kinds of reasons why they wouldn't. And of course, the main reason, because if Russia joins NATO, why do we need NATO? There is no enemy anymore. But in 2008, something important happened. Something monumental happened. This is after Putin gave a speech in Munich in 2007, in which he spelled out his concerns and that Russia will not accept this encroachment that continues happening, this expansion at the doorstep. And he basically reminded them of all the different promises that they gave Russia, that they would not be expanding NATO, and how that this is not going to be acceptable by NATO, and how eventually this is going to blow up in their faces. They completely ignored his warning. They met in April 2008, and they came with an unbelievable statement in which they said that they will welcome Ukraine and Georgia to NATO, that they will start the application process by which NATO would start the assessment as well as the integration of these two countries. And of course, that was the red line. That would not have, and they knew this, but they thought, I think at the time that Russia was too weak. They did it twice before. At one point they had 3, and the next time they had 7. They already added 10. So what is Russia going to do? Let them do whatever they want. We are going to do what we think is correct. You have to keep in mind that this happened during the reign of George W. Bush, where the neocon were in charge, and they were pushing this very, very hard. Now, it didn't take Russia much. Within 4 months, they invaded Georgia to prevent this process from continuing. They have a little bit of populations in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, not much, but they have enough, in which they basically made it very difficult for that integration or for that application to be processed, because now they have occupied places. And for NATO to risk going into Georgia and admitting it into NATO, that means they're going to be at war with Russia. So that military incursion stopped that process. But did they stop? No. They came 1 week after Russia went into Georgia. Within a week, that confrontation ended on August 12th. On August 19th, they came and said, we reaffirm our commitment to the decisions taken by the heads of state of government at the Bucharest summit in April 2008, including those regarding Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations. In other words, we're going to continue trying to integrate them into NATO. And of course, what Russians did, they were trying to do all kinds of tactics in order to prevent Ukraine and Georgia from being admitted to NATO. So in Ukraine, they had more possibilities, including, of course, that they have 17% ethnic Russians on the eastern side. So they wanted to push for those communities to be part of any government, or at least to have a pro-Russian government by which they will veto any decision to join NATO or the European Union and stay close to Russia. And that happened for a while until in February 2014, by which there was this movement that was not only encouraged by the West, by the United States, but also financed. All these NGOs were financed by American, God knows, CIA or other administrations, in which they had these massive demonstrations in order to topple an elected government that was deemed by the European Union and other observers to be fair and free. So they toppled that government, the Soviets and the pro-Russian Ukrainians call it a coup. And after that, it was very clear that the one who succeeded, that is going to push for NATO membership as well as European Union membership. Immediately, the Russians moved to take Crimea. Why is Crimea important? Historically speaking, Crimea was part of Russia, but of course it goes back and forth. The Khrushchev, who was one of the presidents of the Soviet Union, as well as the Secretary General of the Communist Party, he originally from Ukraine. Because this is within the same country, he assigned Crimea, which was disputed, into Ukraine. So what the Soviets, they took it. And why did they take it? Because it's the most important strategic place for their navy. That's where the Russian Navy is stationed. If you take that, that's the end of the access of Russia to the Black Sea, which is a huge strategic disadvantage. So they immediately took it. They have a large Russian contingency there. They voted for independence, and then they joined Russia. Whether we agree or not, but of course, these are geopolitical realities that people have to understand. Many geostrategists predicted this way, way before it actually happened. Now, here, what happened? This is NATO. These are the new members of NATO. They kept expanding and they kept building bases. The latest two bases, which the US Congress funded and the US military have existed, billions of dollars, one in Poland and one in Romania. These two bases are the newest ones. And even the New York Times had an article last week in which it says, it admitted that even the Polish government and the Romanian government don't know what's going on there. They're not even allowed to do there. And God knows whether they have nuclear weapons or not. No one really knows. Of course, the offer that the Americans gave, which was the last minute offer, is that they offered the Russians to come and actually inspect these bases, regardless. Of course, as I told you, the Monroe Doctrine, as I told you, Mexico, if anybody goes to Mexico, how would the Americans react? How they reacted back in 1961 against Cuba. I mean, that's a huge threat perceived by the Russians. Now, just imagine, had they taken Ukraine, how close they would come. Now, we need to remind ourselves of another fact. Back in the old days, during the Cold War, we had an arms race, basically surrounded around who is going to have better nuclear technology that can deliver more powerful warheads and faster warheads. By 1987, we had approximately, of course, that's different from ICBMs, which is the intercontinental. These are the long-range missiles, which are in America and the Soviet Union at the time. These were the intermediate. Intermediate means that they have range anywhere between 500 and 5,000 kilometers. Roughly, we had about 450 on NATO's side and about 750 on the Soviet side. They were pointing towards each other. So these would be full of nuclear warheads, intermediate, and here also intermediate, and which was really very dangerous because we're talking about minutes. Any miscalculation could devastate a city or a country. So in 1987, during Reagan, the 40th president of the United States, they had an agreement. It's called the INF agreement, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement, by which they are going to prevent and destroy all these intermediates, so that there will be no errors. So that was taking place. And then in 2000, in 2000, uh, 2018, announced his intention to terminate within months to withdraw. It's yeah, that was to be effective. So by August 2nd, 2019, the United States was no longer bound by this. Now, I want to add all these together. You are expanding. You are building military bases. Costing billions of dollars, high tech. Even the host countries don't know what's going on there. You withdraw from the INF treaty, in which now you are free to station nuclear weapons close to Russia, in which it may take a minute or two or three to reach any Russian sea. How would the Russians perceive this? Except that they have been public. And that's exactly what happened. That they kept complaining. And of course, once the Americans withdrew, then the Russians started back reducing and avoiding the of weapons. I want you also to keep in mind another reason, because I'm trying to put this all together, is that for many years, obviously with the resurrection of Russia, it was built basically on energy production, primarily oil and gas. And Putin was able to wrestle the control of Russia's oil reserves and gas reserves. And now this was the basic thing that the Russians were depending on in order to sustain the economy. They have massive agricultural products. They have massive weapon sales, and they have massive energy sales. But beside that, very little else. So and I said their economy is about $1.5 trillion, which is it's about twice as Turkey, but it's less than Italy, less than many other countries, certainly less than France and England, about 4 or 5% of the US. So it's not really a major economy yet. They're stable. And they were able to forge a very important relationship with Germany, because Germany, which is a huge industrial country, lacks energy. And the most economical source for their energy was the Russian Federation or Russia. And they had this, what you call Nord Stream, this orange line, which was effectively operational in 2011, but it wasn't enough. It takes about 55 billion cubic feet of energy, of gas. So they need another one, and the US was totally against. Why? Because also they fear this this Russian cooperation will come in close, because if anything, Britain fears on the continent of Europe, it is Germany aligning itself with either France or Russia. Now, if they come very close to Russia, that is a classical threat to them, and therefore they wanted to sabotage this cooperation. And I can tell you that there are many legislation. Of course, the Americans also, they don't want this kind of cooperation. They always against the other, which is what balancing. So the US Congress for many years, they started sanctioning Russian companies, because this pipeline costs about $11 billion, and the Russians pay a lot of taxes.
Sami,
so they always sanction any company.
I'm having trouble hearing you. Is everybody else able to hear you?
Oh my God, really? Okay. Where did you lose me, or was it all along?
I've been having trouble for the past 5-6 minutes. I even disconnected and came back on. I'm not really sure if that didn't really help me. So, Jalal, can you hear Dr. Sami?
Yes, but there is a problem, I think.
5-6.
Sound problem. Yes, but there is a problem, I think. 3 or 4 sound problem.
Okay, give me a minute.
It seems like your internet may have some problem. Could you maybe try to connect through your phone?
1 second.
Could you maybe try to connect through your phone?
No, I will fix it. Just 1 second. Let's see if there's a problem here that we need to. Okay, is it better now?
Yeah, it's better. I mean, I'll let you know if it's if again you become very choppy.
Okay, where did I lose you?
I disconnected before you started speaking about the pipeline.
Okay, all right.
But I would like to also remind you that we're running up against time. So if you could conclude.
Yeah, I'll try to wrap up within a few minutes. I'll just make some conclusions. And I just wanted to go, I will spare you the details of this. I'm trying to say this. Another reason why the US has been encouraging Ukraine not to agree or not to work out a deal with Russians is because of this pipeline that a lot of people are not noticing, because they're trying to sabotage this potential alliance between Germany and Russia. And in fact, the US Congress, I think you could see here, this is different sanctions that happen every time this pipeline is going forward. They would sanction these companies. They did it in 2017, 2019, 2020. Briefly, the Americans agreed to let it go last year because of German pressure, and then they came back and tried. They have stiff resistance against it. And of course, now it's the Germans themselves have stopped it. So that one of the objectives, strategic objectives, that was achieved in terms of not having diversifying Germany's power energy needs and try to cut off the Russians. Let me make some concluding remarks. What are the likely scenarios? The reason I went through this is just to give you that this is not a clear-cut case. This is really a great power competition in which the United States was fully part of every decision to pressure Russia. And therefore, there was really, in terms of any realist person in international relations or geopolitics would have predicted this. In fact, many people predicted it back 6, 7, 8 years ago, that this is not going to be sustainable. You cannot simply treat Russia in a way that will eventually disintegrate. Secondly, Russia fears, as well as China, that when you try to contain them and try to bring these regimes next to their countries, and under the mantra of spreading democracy and having all these kind of regimes, is that you're fomenting dissent, you're fomenting regime change. Because in the way they had regime change back in 2014, that if they keep this going, that eventually what you're going to try to do or get is regime change in Russia, as well as regime change eventually in China. But Russians, of course, drew the red line, and they thought that they had no choice but to move forward. I haven't spoken, of course, about Russians' involvement in Syria and others because it's beyond the talk here, but everything here was related. Perhaps in question and answers, we can do that. What are the likely scenarios? Well, there are several outcomes. One is that Russia wins. Not just wins, but it asserts its will on the Ukrainian and with the regime change. In other words, it changes the government and brings a government that's going to be pro-Russian, by which case they will have an agreement with them with all the demands. And the demands are very simple. Number one, that they will never join NATO. And number two, that their military capability will depend on Russia and not on the West. Of course, what we're seeing now is completely the opposite. If they are able to do that, obviously, then Russia will have the leverage and the upper hand. But at least if they don't, they want to at least keep the eastern side in the Donbass region, which are ethnically Russians, and try to destabilize the situation. And by having an unstable unstable country, they will never, of course, join NATO. And of course, this will always be a point of contention with the West. And of course, there is a huge cost that Russia has to pay in terms of economy, in other words, and other costs to its economy as well as to its presence throughout the world. But that's the other thing is that if they occupy, and that's what many people in the West are banking on, and they get huge resistance, the same way that the Afghani people resisted Russian invasion of Afghanistan and presence and over 10 years, and that they have to withdraw. If that's what the West wants, of course, and if they are successful, and I'm not sure that they will be, but if they are successful in turning Ukraine into resisting Russia militarily by having a war of attrition against its presence, its soldiers, its equipment, and so on, I think that will probably be the end of Russia as a great power. I mean, it will retreat back and it will stay there for a long time. That it's unable. Of course, very difficult to imagine a country with thousands of nuclear weapons being contained. But of course, the same way Russia collapsed after the Afghani resistance and its withdrawal, it could go back into another 20, 30 years of hibernating. So these are one or two or three different possibilities. And of course, I can talk about other scenarios. Certainly, Russia has no intention to surrender or no intention to give somebody like Putin. He will make sure that is not, and they will be ruthless in their tactics against any resistance or any rebels. The other question, and then I leave the rest for Jalal, in which he will probably talk about other reasons as well as the international situation with China and others, is what is the impact of the Muslim world? Because there are many people who are taken with these lofty principles. You know, we're trying to assert people's power. We're trying to build a democracy. We want to be free and so on and so forth. I don't want them to be taken by that, because certainly if that happens and we're back into a unipolar world, that's not in the interest of small countries, or certainly not in the interest of the Muslim world. Our stake here is that we want, let me stop sharing here. Our interest is really having a multipolar world, because in a unipolar world, that great power can make many mistakes and get away with it. Their margin of error, their margin of making mistakes is so huge, is that they can walk all over us and get away with it. And indeed, that's what happened after 9/11 until about 3 or 4 years ago. They invaded Iraq. I mean, everything they're saying about Ukraine, they did it in Iraq, by the way, and Afghanistan, and no one was holding them responsible. They can walk all over the Muslim world, do whatever they want. They can arrest whoever they want. They can invade whoever they want. They can kill, abduct, rendition, you name it, and they get away with it because no one would hold them accountable. So it is in the interest of small countries, it's the interest of weak countries and weak governments and others to have multipolar world, because that gives you a measure of freedom that you can walk, and also makes that country, that's great power, to be more precise in their policies, because their margin of error cannot be so huge. It has to be very much calculated, because any small error, they can pay a huge cost for it. So when it comes to in this crisis, it is not in the interest of the world, as well as not interest certainly of the Muslim world, to for Russia to come out of this totally defeated, and you have again back into the multipolar world. And don't ever be deceived that somehow Western countries, they have multipolar. They're only one polar in that system, and everybody has already acceded to that polar. We really have no great powers in the Western except the United States. And of course, there is a rising power, which is China. And so that's going to balance that. But having three powers is even better than having two. And of course, China has been very cautious, and I'm sure Jalal will address that too, in how it perceives its power, and they're very patient. They're willing to wait for many. So to make the long story short, I don't think we should be drawn into this conflict by being deceived by Western media. I think that happened too often, particularly during the Gulf War and others. I think we have to be very careful to understand the real reasons why this war is taking place, and we should not be cheering here or there. Of course, we stand by the principles. We also hope that there will be no war, because wars are always disasters and terrible, and there's a human suffering that we don't encourage. But also, we need to understand the different lessons coming out of this, and to understand what's going on. One last lesson that we should know is that Ukraine in 1990, it had over 2,000 nuclear warheads. And it was a promise from the United States, from Britain, from Russia, that if they give up their nuclear weapons, they will never be invaded. They believed that, and it turned out to be an absolute lie. So never give up your power. Never give up what you have, because once you're done, I mean, if it kept 200, it had 2,000. If it kept 10, Putin, Russia, others would think 10 times before they would invade or do anything. So that shows the importance of not giving up your power, particularly if it's nuclear and you already have it. Let me stop here, and I'll be very happy to take any questions once Jalal is done. Thank you. As you know, most Muslim countries, with very few exceptions, they really are not really independent. They don't really have what is called sovereignty, making decisions based on interest. They are mainly manipulated by the great power rivalry and by the relationships that exist today. And it's no secret that the United States holds huge leverage and power over many of them. And this is a time where they are not permitted to stray away. I mean, there are cases where it gives them the space, gives them the ability to cover their tracks because of certain domestic considerations. But this is huge vote, because it wants to show that Russia is isolated and that they have very few votes in their favor. I mean, even those who have extremely delicate relationship with Russia, such as Pakistan, such as Iran, they abstained. I mean, they didn't even vote with Russia, obviously for several reasons. Part of it is also because they don't believe in invading other countries. They have to be consistent. But nevertheless, they do have lots of concerns about how the West has been pushing Russia to invade Ukraine, and how they really have very little choices, considering the geopolitical risks that were taking place at their borders. So just to answer this question about what does it tell us about the international order and when the Muslim nations are, pretty much they are not independent, they're not sovereign. Many of them were given some leeway in establishing relationships with Russia. I think now the US is going to have tremendous pressure on them to choose sides. There are countries such as Algeria, they have historic relationships with Russia. They're not going to adhere to that kind of pressure. There are ones that had historical relations, but they shifted, like Egypt, long time ago, over 40 years ago. They are mainly dependent on Western largesse, IMF and other aids. So but they were given some leeway to have a relationship with Russia. Now they cannot stray from that. They have to adhere to Western and American dictates. And there are countries which are traditionally opposing to the West, such as Iran, for example, in which the West knows that they cannot really control their decisions. At the same time, Iran has to be consistent with some of its policies, and it also has its own small rivalry with Russia. But when it comes to the big issues, it's going to side with Russia. And indeed, that's what happened here, and that explains its abstention. So what does it tell us about the Muslim world? we lack sovereignty, we lack independence, we lack strategic thinking. If, as I said in my remarks, if we are going to look at the real interest of any small nation, let alone the Muslim world, we really need to have multipolar world. That a unipolar world is always not in our favor.
My point of raising that point, Dr. Sami, was that if that is in fact the case, that smaller, weaker countries, or let's say non-regional hegemons, countries that are not hegemonic, if it's in their best interest to actually have a multipolar world, then these countries should have voted, not just the Muslim countries, they should have voted in either being absent to show that they don't show on either side, or they should have voted against. But it seems like most countries disagree with that analysis.
It's not about disagreeing, it's about the balance of power. They cannot, because the Americans are going to come and have a ton of bricks. It's the moment of either you're with us or against us type of thing. So if they have an IMF loan in the waiting, if they have some aid in the waiting, if they have some kind of whatever leverage the US may have over these small, even the use of the dollar. I mean, the US has been increasingly using this weapon. This has been weaponized. That's a new phenomenon. And they perfected it now in the era of the unipolar. Now it's being used against Russia. The US currency controls about 63 to 65% of world transactions. And if you're going to defy the US, look at what happened to Iran's economy. Look what happened to the Russian economy. Look what happened to other kinds of Venezuelan economies. Once you are ostracized from the financial system, it wrecks your economy. No one is willing to take that. What's the UN vote? Even if they totally disagree with the United States on this, deep down, they would have to vote in a way that they're not going to anger the United States. And that's basically what we're seeing here. I'm not saying that this is the case, but there are countries that they can't typically simply vote for this because it's against their traditional stance, such as Algeria and Iran. So the best they can do is to abstain. It's a good question. Let me make 2 points because of the time. My first point had to do with what you call, there are sins of omission and sins of commission. So the fact that you have unipolar power in the world, that puts you right in front of that power. You have very little maneuver. And then if you are at the receiving end of that power, you are really suffering. And I think we've seen that in many cases in the past quarter century, particularly in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places. So-called global war on terror. You really have very little maneuver to get away from that power once they set their sights on you. But once you have a multipolar world, what happens is that that power now has to extend a considerable amount of time trying to face that other polars. You know, whether it's China or whether it is Russia, they're going to pay very little attention to the smaller powers, and particularly to movements or peoples. We've seen the Arab Spring movement coming in the midst of the unipolar moment. And there was very little maneuver because once the United States decided that they are not going to be in favor of the people gaining their own independence and setting up their own governments, they let these small powers basically do whatever they want with their people and get away with it. But these kind of calculations, I'm not saying that it's going to be for or against, but it gives you more room to maneuver, more room, more space to do certain things, and they're not going to pay a lot of attention. And it's a good thing that we, when the great powers, particularly the United States and other great powers, don't pay much attention to you, that gives you a little bit of room to do whatever you want to do, hopefully in the direction of movements and countries that are changing for the best of the people. The other point I want to make, which is about governments rather than movements and peoples, Again, governments, particularly those who are trying to become independent, who are trying to assert their power, their sovereignty. I can think of Algeria, I can think of Turkey, I can think of Iran, I can think a little bit of Pakistan. Some of these countries that are trying to get out of that grip, that pressure. They're not client states like others that we see in the region, but they're trying to assert a little bit of independence, a little bit of sovereignty. They're trying to be really representative of their own people. When they are under one power, one polar, they really cannot resist a lot. But when you have a multipolar system, there you have that maneuvering power. So when China started building the last point, building the Road and Belt Initiative, and Pakistan was part and parcel of this initiative, certainly, it was a sovereign decision, and the US had to live with it, even though they were not happy with it. And I think the more these polars become powerful, the more you will have that ability to go out and do things that may not be to the liking of the other polars.